Welcome, listeners, to the Radically Student-Centered podcast series where we dive into how a design of learning spaces directly shapes how students experience curriculum. We're excited to welcome Susan Morgan, Education Practice Leader at CannonDesign. Her expertise includes architect design, project management, and faculty advisement. Susan has successfully led projects in higher ed as well as in Boston public schools. In her work, she focuses on client leadership, community engagement, and commitment to student success. Welcome, Susan.
Yes, thank you so much, Jessica. Glad to be here.
Amazing. So why don't we start with a little bit about you and how you got into, school design and your journey here.
Yeah, so I loved thinking about how this all started. And I often say that my story goes back to Montessori school. And I realized it literally goes back to Montessori school because my first participation in a building project was to support and at that point, right, I was 10, right? I'd been with the school for, goodness, 7 years at that point. And we were moving from a lease space into creating a ground up new construction school. And the two founders of the school invited students to participate in that process. And so on the one hand, they were drawing from how Montessori generally organizes spaces, but they invited us, what do you want to see? How do you want to use the spaces? And so I did that before I left elementary school. And that was my first one. And then I realized I was also a student leader for my high school's renovation and expansion. So before I left school, I was already starting to help design schools, which is such a treat.
That's amazing. Did you have, like, as a 10-year-old walking into that new school, were you able to walk into the new Montessori school and have like an aha moment of like, wait, like I said this, or
Yes.
I was really looking for this. Tell me about that.
So what's interesting is I see parallels between my grandfather, who was an architect, and in one of the houses he designed, you would walk into the hallway, and the end of the hallway was actually a mirror. And so you were looking back at the forest behind you. And the kind of aha moment I had in the Montessori school is the first thing you see when you walk in the door is the playground visible at the end of the hallway. So you're looking out to nature. You're looking out to something. You're looking out to a place you want to go. And so those two things came together even at that first stage.
Oh my God, that's amazing. And that even goes back to even, younger than 10 years old with your grandfather having that design process too.
Yes.
And so you have always been in design. I know that you worked for a few other firms prior and architect and design. Talk to me about the schools and the school design that you have been able to kind of engage in over the course of your work.
So as somebody who decided to become an architect at 3.5, and I never changed my mind, I was connected to the idea, and I'd had these great experiences in buildings that were a part of my learning. Like my schools had design features that I connected with. My schools took me to museums where I learned things. The first K through 12 school that I worked on was actually here in Boston. At the time, it was called the John P. Holland School. It's now the Up Academy. And we were working with a 1970s open plan school that just didn't work anymore. Students couldn't concentrate, teachers couldn't teach, and because it was designed during the energy crisis, it didn't have many windows. And so as this young designer just out of graduate school, we were fortunate enough, and my firm at the time, Schwartz Silver, was great enough to give me the opportunity to help redesign the exteriors because we took off the exterior walls. We wanted to make them more insulated. And my first step was to make sure there were windows that were at the height of students. Because before they had been these windows that were so high and they were at adult only levels. And so kids couldn't see outdoors, right? And so it was so fun because we were able to create this animated facade and as part of enclosing the classrooms, make sure that each classroom was connected both inside and out.
Absolutely. And I love that like we'll talk about Montessori a little bit more because I have one of my experiences was being a director of an early childhood center at Bright Horizons, which is across the nation. And part of our development was every week, me and the teacher, the lead teacher of that classroom, got on our hands and knees. And we saw what the students saw because putting things together when you see it from an adult level, it was just, okay, great. Like I see these tabletops that have wonderful, textures and colors, but like that bottom level, like what are our students actually
Touching,
seeing in terms of
yes.
texture? And yes, absolutely. And it was such a nice reflection, I think, for teachers and for students too, when students realize that something new had been put out, right? Because at that age, you're just looking for that distraction or that, kind of engagement and curiosity. And so I love that thinking about immediately, the students need to be able to see what's going on, right?
Yes.
Which brings us to like this radically student-centered approach, which, K-12 is all about. Talk to me about your experience and what radically student-centered means and how you take your experience as being brought into the process into now the design experience and bringing other students into that process.
So I love that K-12's maxim of radically student-centered design, it connects with CannonDesign. We talk about whole student, every student.
Really?
We talk about people are everything. And in both of these invitations, when we consider that design is not about creating objects, that design is about creating places for people, then the step that goes into that is to say, I'm helping to form someone's life and their experience out in the world. And it's one of the reasons I became an architect is because my environments shaped me. They inspired my curiosity and my hunger. And so for me, radically student-centered design is about what does each human need to show up with their best self every day.
I love that.
And you don't put any more limits on that. Like, what do you need to be your best self?
Absolutely. And I'm so curious of when you talk to schools, right, and you're in that vision phase, what kind of responses do you get when you're asking them to like take design and furniture out of the conversation? What do you want your kids to experience every day? What type of feedback do you get from those conversations?
So you've hit the nail on the head, which is it's such a natural tendency for all of us, whether we're designers, whether we're administrators, whether we're teachers. We want to start to talk about the problems. Here's what doesn't work with my classroom now. Here's what needs to be changed from what I have now. And this invitation with radically student-centered design to say that we're focused on what do these emerging humans need? What's really beneficial is you have teachers who've been in the business for decades. My mother was a public high school English teacher for over 35 years, right? She was dedicated to teaching, right? And the way that teachers and administrators talk about their students is so different than how they talk about their work. Because when they talk about their students, they talk about seeing somebody flourish and thrive. They talk about what it means for a student who has a handful of siblings at home to come to school and have a place to focus. And so that's such a restructuring of the conversation. And that's what we try to do is, hey, everyone, there's a place where we can put the challenges you have with your existing environments, but let's park that and let's start from what do your students need? Because you know your students, you know your community.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important for us to include the teachers into the conversation because they can almost, like you said, they can kind of turn off the stresses of curriculum and, parent conversations and everything they have on their to-do list. I was an educator for 15 years in New York City. I 100% have felt it. And you're right. I love that you can name that how you think about the world around you as a teacher in your classroom versus how you think about your students is completely different. And just the language you use and how you really do want the best for them every single day. And that comes with the learning designs, right? And the learning spaces that we're putting in front of them. But being part of that conversation is just so vitally important to us and to my role, especially of just being able to be in the school and hear from the teachers and hear from the district and the community and what they need. So absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I would love to dive into one of the projects to actually hear that full circle experience, right? Because I did get to listen to a panel. I know you had, is it Irman
Crest.
Thank you. Irman Crest School. I have watched that hour panel because I'll let you speak about it, but I think it's a really great example of doing something progressive, right, in a way that made sense to them, right, to the school, because every school is individual and every school wants the best, but not everyone can dream of the best or maybe come to that compromise. And I think that they talked a lot about active learning everywhere and just these. I'm really curious to hear about that whole experience from your team, how you bring in, the Children's Museum, a school, and still know that, right, they still have the same tests that everyone in the district has. They still have the same expectations and curriculum. So I'm going to pause so that you can talk to me about that project, because it was really something different that I would love to highlight for our listeners.
Yeah, so I appreciate that invitation. We, as a group, are really collectively proud of our continuity with the Seneca Valley School District. It started with Irman Crest, which is their elementary school, right? So you're doing K through 4. It's now continuing with our work with the independent high school, and that's 7 through 12. And what it started from was the school district saying, what if?
Yes.
And
I heard that. Yes.
That invitation and what became a true three-way collaboration with the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh was anchored, and I kind of love that there's a throughway here for me and my background, a throughway to asking, what if a building could be a tool for learning? It's not just a place you learn, but what if the building was a part of your learning? And I just want that to sink in a little bit, because when we think of buildings as places where you do things, then we think of them as boxes that you put activities into. And a radically student-centered approach says, what if the building is a part of your learning pathway, your learning tools, and your learning framework? And that invites every constituent, from the superintendent to the principal to the faculty, to every aspect, down to the students, to the families that use it, to say, what if?
Wow. That is incredible. To really take a pause and to think about not only the what if, but the learning tool. That was really, really powerful, to think about your school, as a tool, as a way to learn, and we talked about Montessori quickly, but vertical, horizontal learning, never something that I see in a normal K through 6 school.
Nope.
But we know with younger generation and child development and neuroscience that when a child walks in the classroom, and before they even get to the classroom, in the hallways, they're, engaging in, maybe a track on the hallway or a Lego building, and they're pausing with their family to build a quick house before they go in. It completely changes the student's experience with school. And that is incredible that you're not only doing that work, but that it was successful at this school, so much so that you're bringing in the high school. And this is a K through 6 range school. So were there any specific examples of maybe like balance of, this is what we want and this is what we can do, in terms of it being, a K through 6 school, if there was any barriers or, complications?
Do you know what's interesting, which is, I think because each of the 3 stakeholders was brought to the table from the start, there wasn't the kind of expansion and contraction you sometimes have during design, where you talk about everything you absolutely want to have, and then you have to put it back in a box, right? The team was fully aware of the budget. They were aware of the space available and how to develop it. And so in that sense, the most powerful, in addition to the what if question, I would say the second most powerful anchor for the team's work was to think of a school not as something which is static and that becomes like a heritage building over time, right? One of my colleagues talks about the mural on the wall that was painted 30 years ago and you can't change it. But that when you take that mindset, the museum mindset, that your environments are planned to be adaptable and to change over time, and that your environment is living because your learning is always evolving and growing, right? Whether it's with technology, whether it's with the kind of topics you want to focus on. Setting that foundation allowed us to be really focused in how we planned the school. So I know you're looking for like a really great struggle, but in some
No, I
ways,
think
by
that that's a
setting clear
great,
expectations, there was actually less of a struggle.
When we work with schools at K-12, it's not just about furniture design, it's about impact. Our radically student-centered approach puts students at the center of every decision. From that first conversation to the final walkthrough, we're focused on creating spaces that actually work for the kids, the teachers, and the community. So if you're looking to do more than just check a box on your next project, let's talk. Visit K12.com. That's KAY-TWELVE.com and see how we're helping schools transform learning one student at a time. Because at K-12, it's not just about projects and furniture, it's about purpose.
And that brings me to one curious moment I had. I love someone had mentioned, like, they wanted to just to ensure that everyone felt safe, right, in this building, safe to take chances as well. And I think of, something that is so radical. What was the, if you knew, because the district I'm sure probably did it, but what was like that teacher training to get them to understand how their actual practice might change a little bit? And there's so much, turnover, and teachers come from all different, backgrounds. But was there any specific teacher training that you guys, either you were a part of or maybe not a part of, to get them ready to, like, this is going to change your practice, is going to feel uncomfortable. I'm sure your mom knows it, right? When new initiatives come out, there's moments of like fear of that control. I feel it too. If you knew of any insights, if you could talk to me about that, something I'm really curious about with a project like that.
So this was also a case where, and I'm going to use the term bravery because it was actually also kind of a maxim that the superintendent, Dr. Vitale, had developed. It was an anchor for the team's work. So it was brave to include staff from the beginning to end. So
absolutely,
we all know about the stories that sometimes a school is delivered and teachers just show up, right? That was not this experience. So the bravery was to involve key staff along the way, to have them participate in the planning, to be sharing what this was starting to become. But really importantly, in this case, the way in which we work with the museum staff is they were actually teaching all of us. So it wasn't about the architects telling the staff and the teachers how to use the building. It was the museum teams inviting all of us to understand how environments really can be used. What does it mean to bring loose objects right into the space? What does it mean to take advantage of the things that are embedded in the walls, right? And that was one of the exciting parts about this building is there isn't a single plain white corridor anywhere. Every corridor has interactives. Every corridor has color. And this invitation for the museum to not be afraid, because we were sharing that with staff along the way, there didn't need to be one moment of exponential learning or transformative mindset change with the staff, because that was actually happening along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And they probably felt very empowered being part of the conversation to share it with others, right? Because not every teacher is available at every second, but being able to manipulate and feel it and get excited about it. We've seen it in schools. That's what trickles to everyone else. And then when everything is unreal, no matter how involved you are, you feel involved. And I love that was such a priority, I think, in the project. And I'm sure led to it being as successful. I know the high school, is there anything that you're kind of taking from that experience onto, where you're starting with the high school now?
Yes, great question, right? Because they're different learners, right? So you're not gonna, how you visually and spatially engage older learners is different, and they don't want to be talked down to, and they don't want to be pandered to, right? So it isn't cut, set, print, repeat, right? That is not this process. The linkage between the two is the idea of discovery. So at Irman Crest, there is this invitation for young learners to simply discover, to connect with ideas and content, and to just engage with the world, right? Tactily in the way that those young learners do.
Yes.
And for IHS, discovery is about starting to see yourself in the world in ways in which you maybe haven't imagined. And so quite literally, and again, I'm going to kind of harp into corridors, you don't have corridors, you have intentional perspectives and views. At a given moment, you can look to the athletics field, and that allows you to say, hey, that looks like fun, I want to do it. And another part of the building, you're looking into the performing arts area. In older school design, everything would live in different wings, and there could be parts of the building you would avoid. And you might choose to avoid it, but you wouldn't realize that you were missing that chance to be exposed to something that you might be interested in. And so in that invitation to discover, that is a literal spatial plan, spatial connection that's happening in this building, so that every student in the course of a day is exposed to science, to fine arts, right? Into making and crafting, into moving their bodies in athletics, right? Into health sciences. And so no one is going to have their possibilities limited by lack of exposure. Or the other way to put it is every student, their mindset is opened because they are literally visually connected to, can see, can participate, can be invited to engage in everything that the world has to offer.
And I love that it's not only built from that, right? In this idea of facilitating this student experience. I know that's said often of like, that's what we want to do. We want to facilitate the student experience, but also I believe I read a little bit about the school that the auditorium and the theater program is pretty famous for this school, like it's something that they're very, 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 very interested in. So I love that, not only like kind of giving that the grace that it needs, because it's obviously there's tradition there's history that comes with that, but expanding them to like, yes, this is one thing our school could do, but look at the possibilities if you're not interested in that, or look what else you can do. And that age group, developing in that age group, that's why I'm a big fan of CTE and everyone that is kind of going into that direction, because you're developing so much at that time. And you said you knew you wanted to be an architect, and I've been blessed to know that I wanted to be, in education, but a lot of people don't know that. And you miss out on those years of developmental curiosity before you get to, either trade school, college, workforce, wherever you want to go after that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, and I'm just going to highlight, right? When many of us, and particularly, let's say, at our younger ages, when we think about joining the drama club, right, or joining a production, we say in a very binary way, am I somebody who wants to be on stage or not? And if we say no, then we think there's nothing else for us. But a production includes oftentimes musicians. So you could be somebody who plays an instrument and participate. It includes your technical team. You could be somebody who's really good at painting and you actually join with set development, right? You could be somebody who dreams of being a music producer and you're going to be in the sound booth. And that's how IHS and our design of it is changing and shifting, which is by making these things literally visible and accessible. Nobody's stopping at that single binary assumption of either I'm on stage or I'm off, because there's and of course that applies to other disciplines and departments too.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's opening the doors for them, which brings me to, you've been in this industry for a very long time, and social emotional learning, this idea of curiosity in school, it's all new for us. It's, I'm sure, very normal, but how has your design approach maybe evolved with all of these changes to teaching and learning on like a personal level? Is there anything that you had to reflect on or maybe even change in your practice, because we're just realizing and developing all these new ideas of what schools can be and are?
What I have appreciated, and I'm somebody who always wants to learn and grow, so I'm gathering information from researchers, from teachers, and from others. what has felt like a door that's unlocked is all of the science that tells us that when different bodies engage the world in different ways, they are able to tap into their best self, right? So in days before now, everybody had to sit in a chair, and we would get mad at those students who had challenges focusing. But what science shows us is that small ability, right? The reason why we have these chairs that rock and move is a small rock and move unlocks the ability to pay attention. And once you're paying attention, you're engaging and connecting. And so what I really love is that for all of us in the galaxy and the ecosystem of education, we all now know so much more about how student bodies, both young and old, what they need to be present in the learning environments. And it's so much more than we thought was possible. And these very small things have very, very big impacts.
Oh, absolutely. The role of, educators has changed so much. And that just
Yes.
sparked, I, again, a little bit new to the industry, but I recently read The End of Average. And I continuously go back to Todd Ross, like continuously.
Yes.
I mean, I was reading it and there were moments where I was like, wow, like I have very recently started to living in New York City, right? You don't think about the things that are very geared towards like right-handed people or, able bodies. And from reading this, I feel like I'm constantly reflecting on this idea of, what biases do I have of this average, knowing that the children are like, we're not average. None of us are. In fact, if you take 10 of us, none of us fit into that category anymore.
Exactly.
And I think that's so incredible when you think about teaching and learning and just the dynamics around what is changing and what people are adapting to, right? It's not I love that it's not a, black, white kind of area. It's very much like everyone seems to be on board to where we're going in education. And that's why they need people like us to help them through that design process and just make sure that their goals and priorities are really seen throughout these buildings.
Yes.
Absolutely. But we talked about social media. I love your social media presence. I know we talked very briefly about it. As an always learner, I am on the track to continue learning too. Do you have any resources or insights that you would like to share with the audience and kind of leave them with to explore, after they listen to our session?
Yeah. So as I reflected on radically student-centered design and radically student-centered learning, I came back to my foundations and I was thinking about, right, we're all different. Our communities are different. And so what is a tool or a resource that I go back to time and again? And the one I'm going to share is one that I share with my colleagues, but also with my students because I also teach architecture. And that is the Montessori patterns. And so if you go to montessori-architecture.org/patterns, and in fact, if you just go to montessori-architecture.org, you'll kind of get there. It actually walks you through, and this came from an analysis of Montessori spaces and schools globally, which is like such a wonderful thing, right? It isn't just a Western approach, but it's globally. It talks about tools and techniques that are radically student-centered, right? One of them is the difference between acoustics as you think about it as noise versus acoustics and thinking about it as sound. And so for folks who are like me, #always learning, this is great. It's easily digestible. They provide visual references to projects from around the world. So you actually see images of each of these patterns in practice. But one thing that Montessori does so successfully is it creates environments of invitation. And that's what we're now trying to do in mainstream schools, public schools, and schools for learning of all ages. So that's one of my go-tos.
No, and I very much appreciate that and sharing with the audience as well, because I think there is a language barrier sometimes when when people are thinking of, like you said, a sound versus noise versus loud, and they're like, oh, I want it to be quiet. And it's like, do you want it to be quiet or do you want it to be productive? right?
Yes,
Or
exactly.
do you want it to be debating, right? Or like, a big debate versus like group work is wonderful to bring up that. So thank you so much for sharing that. On the radically student-centered do you have any takeaway that you want our listeners to remember about being radically student-centered, either a piece of advice or just, a one-liner that we can leave the audience with?
It's tough to pin it down, I will admit. And I have two things to share. One of them is we're all structurally patterned at a biological level to learn and grow. Yep. The best way that we can support that is to remove barriers to our natural curiosity and compassion.
Absolutely.
Like, what a beautiful invitation. And that links to my second point, which is maybe the short and sweet one, which is when learners thrive, communities flourish. And that is what it means to be radically student-centered.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Susan. I very much appreciate it. Thank you for your time, your expertise, and your insights today. It was a pleasure learning with you. If listeners would like to hear more or share their own radically student-centered moments, we invite you to like, comment, and share at betterlearningpodcast.com.
The Better Learning Podcast is produced by Matt Rogers and edited by Kelly Jones. The views and opinions shared on this podcast are those of the individual speaking and do not necessarily represent the perspectives of their affiliated companies, organizations, or associations.